On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a woman stood in a barn in Iowa and listened to a man explain why her life's work was finished. He'd driven 3 hours to tell her this. Brought charts. Spoke about consolidation and efficiency and the inevitable future. Said it politely. Almost apologetically. She didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. Just thanked him for coming, the industry had decided. Small shops like hers couldn't compete with automated factories pumping out units for $45. Her rebuilds cost twice that. The math was simple. He left. She went back to work. What he didn't know, what the entire industry didn't know, was that she'd been documenting something for 30 years. 600 index cards. Every failure, every fix, every detail the big plants had stopped caring about. And she knew something they'd forgotten. On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Margaret Brennan stood inside a barn that smelled like motor oil and cold iron and watched a man from Delco Remy explain why her business was finished. The man's name was Philip Adler. He wore a company jacket, carried a clipboard, had driven 3 hours from Anderson, Indiana, to deliver this news in person, which Margaret thought was a strange amount of effort for a company that was, as Philip explained it, simply evolving with the times. The times as Philip saw them meant something he called consolidation. Big rebuilding houses merging operations. Automated assembly lines in plants across Ohio and Michigan and Indiana. Units coming off those lines at $45 retail. Clean, consistent. Fast. Margaret's rebuilds cost $65 to $110, depending on the application. The math was not complicated. Philip laid it out with the patient condescence of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times. For many people. In many barns just like this one, Margaret listened to all of it. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't point out that his $45 units lasted maybe 18 months if you were lucky, and that her rebuilds went 3 years minimum and sometimes longer. She thanked Philip Adler for driving 3 hours. Walked him back to his company car, watched the taillights disappear down County Road D35. Then she went back inside the barn, picked up the alternator she'd been working on before Philip arrived. And she kept working because what else was there to do? Let me tell you about Margaret Brennan before you can understand what happened next. People called her Maggie. She was 44 years old in the spring of 1987. Tall for a woman, 5'10" without shoes. Lean in the way farmers get lean, not from dieting, from lifting things and standing on concrete floors and not sitting down much. She had grown up on her father's farm outside Eldora, Iowa. Second of 3 children. Only daughter, which meant she learned early that being the only girl didn't excuse you from work. Her father was Frank Morrison, a mechanic. The kind who could take apart a tractor engine blindfolded and put it back together and have it run better than new. He taught Maggie everything he knew about machines. Not because he believed women belonged in machine shops. He didn't, not really. But because Maggie wouldn't stop asking questions and Frank Morrison respected persistence more than he respected social convention. So he taught her how to read a wiring diagram, how to test voltage under load, how to tell the difference between a burned winding and a shorted stator by the smell alone. This is temporary, he told her once when she was 16. You'll get married, have kids. This is just so you can help your husband if his truck breaks down. Maggie didn't say anything. She was good at not saying things. Frank died in 1976. Heart attack in the barn. 61 years old, Maggie was 33. She had a degree from Iowa State in agricultural mechanics. Class of 1965. One of 3 women in a program of 140 men. The other 2 dropped out before sophomore year. She had farmed for 12 years after college. Married Thomas Brennan in 1967. A quiet man, an accountant, the kind who kept 3 sets of books just to be sure, and who never understood why Maggie needed to take apart the combine every winter to see how the parts were wearing. They tried for kids. It didn't happen. Maggie didn't talk about it much. Thomas didn't either. They just kept going. In 1978, Maggie took $14,000 she'd saved from 12 years of farming and she bought equipment, a lathe, a winding machine, a test bench, all of it used, some of it ancient. The lathe was a 1954 South Bend 13-inch she'd found at an estate sale in Webster City for $200. The owner had died. His kids didn't want it. Maggie rebuilt the headstock herself, replaced the ways, had it running in a week. The winding machine was a 1961 Acme Electric from a shop in Waterloo that had closed in 1975. Maggie paid $400 for it and drove there in a borrowed truck and loaded it herself because Thomas had a bad back and the seller wasn't interested in helping. The test bench she built from scratch, a 1949 Ford flathead engine block bolted to a welded steel frame, connected to a variable speed drive she'd salvaged from a grain elevator that had burned down outside Iowa Falls. It would load test an alternator at any amperage from 10 to 120 amps, which was more than most commercial test benches of the era could manage. She converted the old dairy barn on their property, the one Frank built in 1952. White paint peeling, gambrel roof, Concrete apron in front where the milk trucks used to park. She put up a sign, Foster Electrical Rebuilding. Black letters on a white board. Thomas asked her once if she was sure about this. She looked at him. Are you? He shrugged. You know what you're doing with machines. I know what I'm doing with numbers. We'll figure it out. So they did. By March of 1987, Maggie had rebuilt somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 units. She didn't keep exact count, but she kept something better. A filing cabinet, 4 drawers, steel, painted battleship gray, sitting in the corner of the shop nearest the door. Inside were index cards, hundreds of them, 614 to be exact. Though Maggie didn't know the exact number until later when she counted them all. Each card represented a different alternator model. Each card had information written in Maggie's tight, careful handwriting, wire gauge. Resistance, values, voltage output at full load, common failure points, notes about what worked and what didn't. This was not a database, not a computer file, just cards, and handwriting, and 30 years of paying attention. Maggie added a new card every time she encountered a unit she hadn't worked on before. She updated existing cards when she found something new. If you asked her where the information came from, she would pull open a drawer, show you a card, and say the same thing every time. I opened one up and looked. That was the whole methodology. The phone started ringing less in the spring of 1987. Not a lot less. Just enough that Maggie noticed. Parts stores that had been steady costs for 8 years started calling other suppliers. Dealerships that used to send her their difficult rebuilds stopped sending them. By summer, the difference was obvious. Thomas kept the books. He showed Maggie the numbers one evening in July. They were sitting at the kitchen table. Ledger open between them. You billed 61,000 in 1986. His voice was careful, neutral, the way accountants talk when they're delivering bad news and trying not to make it worse. Maggie nodded. I know, you're on pace for 43 this year. I know. And if the trend continues, I know, Thomas. He closed the ledger. So what are we going to do? Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, at the barn, at the light she'd left on over the test bench. Don't fight the customers nobody else wants, she said finally. Thomas frowned. That's not a plan. That's a hope. It's what I've got. The thing was, Maggie already knew what Philip Adler knew. The consolidators were winning on price. The automated assembly lines could crank out units faster and cheaper than any human winding copper by hand in a barn in Iowa. But she also knew something the consolidators didn't seem to care about. Quality, the old domestic cores. The Delco Remis and Lease Nevilles and Motorola's that had been built in American factories in the 1960s and 70s. Those units were built to a standard that the new mass-produced replacements weren't matching. Maggie knew because she had cut open thousands of them. The stator windings in a good domestic core used heavier gauge wire. The rotors were balanced to tighter tolerances. The housings were cast from better aluminum. The new units coming off the consolidated assembly lines, lighter wire, looser tolerances, cheaper materials. They worked fine out of the box. But they didn't last. Maggie had seen it. In the units that came back to her shop after the cheap replacements failed. Farmers would install a $45 unit. It would run for a year, maybe 18 months. Then it would burn out. And they'd come to Maggie to rebuild the original core properly, because by then, they understood the difference. Thomas was right though. Hope wasn't a plan. So Maggie did something she'd never done before. She got in her truck and she drove 22,000 miles in 1988. She drove to farms, to implement dealerships, to small fleet operations, to custom harvest crews. Within an 80-mile radius of Eldora, she wasn't selling, she was asking questions. What equipment are you running? How old is it? What electrical problems have you been having? Whether the parts stores had been able to help. Most people were polite. Some thought she was wasting their time. A few told her straight out that they didn't do business with women mechanics. Maggie thanked them anyway, moved on. She found a pattern it took months to see. But it was there, farmers and operators running older equipment, 10 years old, 20, 30, equipment for which the consolidated rebuilders weren't stocking cores, because the volume wasn't there, because automation only made sense if you were cranking out thousands of the same unit. A farmer running a 1968 International 1456 with a Motorola alternator couldn't walk into the parts store and buy a replacement. The store didn't stock it. The consolidators didn't rebuild it. The mass production lines didn't tool up for it. But Maggie had the core on her shelf. She had the index card in her filing cabinet. She could rebuild it in 2 days and test it under load and hand it back with a 1-year warranty. She also found something else. The farmers who had tried the cheap mass-produced units were not happy. Not all of them. But enough not because the units didn't work initially. Most of them worked fine out of the box, but they didn't last. A man named Dale Schroeder told her about it one afternoon in the fall of 1988. She'd driven out to his farm outside Grundy Center, unannounced. Just knocked on the door and asked if he had a few minutes. Dale was suspicious at first. Then curious, he took her out to his equipment shed. Showed her his 4440. "I've put 3 alternators on this tractor in 2 years," he said. The frustration in his voice was real. Thick Maggie looked at the tractor. "What kind of units?" "The cheap ones, from the parts store." Dale walked around to the front of the 4440. Kicked the tire. The third one failed during corn harvest. Middle of October. "I sat in the field for 4 hours waiting for my son to bring a replacement from Iowa Falls." He looked at Maggie. 4 hours during corn harvest is not a small thing. "No," Maggie said quietly. "It's not." She rebuilt Dale's core in her shop over the next 2 days. Delco Tensai. She rewound the stator with new copper. Installed a heavy-duty rectifier bridge. Tested it at full load for 45 minutes. Watched the numbers. Made sure nothing moved that shouldn't. She charged him $80. Dale installed it himself. He never called Maggie about an alternator again. Which was exactly the outcome she wanted. Word moved the way word moves in a small county. Slowly, then all at once, by the spring of 1989, Maggie's phone was ringing again, not with the same customers as before. The parts stores and dealerships were still going with the consolidators, but farmers, custom operators, small fleet managers running older equipment, people who had learned through experience that paying twice as much up front was cheaper than replacing cheap units twice as often. They found Maggie, or she found them. Either way, the work started coming back. Thomas updated the books throughout 1989 and into 1990. The numbers were getting better. Not fast, but steady. He showed Maggie the projections one evening in January of 1990. "You'll do about 58,000 this year if the trend holds." Maggie looked at the numbers. "That's better. It's still down from 1986. "I know, but it's moving in the right direction." She nodded. "It is." Thomas closed the ledger. "You found them," he said quietly. Maggie looked up. "What?" "The customers nobody else wanted. You found them." By the spring of 1991, Maggie had rebuilt her customer base to something close to its 1986 level. But the composition had shifted entirely. She wasn't doing much work for the auto parts stores anymore. That business was gone. The dealerships too. What she had instead was a dense network of farmers and custom operators and small fleet managers who ran older equipment that the consolidators couldn't serve profitably. Equipment that needed someone who still knew how to rebuild a Motorola alternator to original 1968 specifications. Maggie was that someone. And then she found something she hadn't expected. A secondary market. People restoring old tractors. Collectors. Enthusiasts. They needed original specification alternators for machines that were 30 or 40 years old. There was no reliable source for correctly rebuilt units. Until they found Maggie. She started getting calls from Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota. Someone would hear about her from someone who'd heard about her from someone else. They'd call, describe what they needed. Maggie would pull the card from her filing cabinet. Quote them a price. Tell them to ship the core. She began advertising in 2 small restoration publications, one out of Decorah, one out of Ottumwa. Within 6 months, she was shipping rebuilt units to customers in 14 states. Thomas did the final accounting for 1991 in January of 1992. He brought the ledger to the kitchen table. Maggie was making coffee. 71,000, he said. She turned. What? You're billing for 1991. 71,000. Maggie set the coffee pot down. That's best year you've ever had. Thomas finished. She sat down. Looked at the numbers. They'd come back. Not the same customers. Not the same business model, but they'd come back. Philip Adler did not drive back to deliver a follow-up speech. Maggie didn't expect him to. The consolidators were still out there. Still cranking out units. Still winning on price for high-volume applications. But Maggie had found the space they couldn't fill, the old equipment, the low-volume cores, the farmers who needed quality more than speed. She had found the gap between what the industry wanted to serve and what the customers actually needed, and she had filled it. One evening in late 1991, Maggie stood in the shop alone. The equipment was quiet, test bench off, lathe still. She walked over to the filing cabinet, pulled open the top drawer, 614 cards, organized by manufacturer, then by model number, then by year. Each one representing a unit she'd opened and looked at and documented. 30 years of paying attention. She ran her fingers across the top edge of the cards. This was the real product, she thought. Not the rebuilt alternators, the knowledge. The alternators were just the delivery mechanism. But the knowledge, that was the thing that couldn't be automated, couldn't be consolidated, couldn't be produced on an assembly line. You had to earn it, one unit at a time, one failure at a time, one card at a time. Thomas found her there 20 minutes later. You okay? Maggie didn't turn around. I'm fine. He walked over, stood next to her, looked at the open drawer. After a moment, he spoke. What happens to all this if something happens to you? Maggie closed the drawer. I don't know. You should think about it. I know, because this, he gestured at the filing cabinet. This is what you've really built. Not the business. This, Maggie looked at him. The shop could burn down. The equipment could be replaced. The building could fall apart. But the filing cabinet, the cards, the information, if that was gone, everything was gone. The winter of 1991 turned into the spring of 1992 without much fanfare. Maggie turned 49 in February. Thomas has made her a cake, chocolate, her favorite. They ate it at the kitchen table. Just the two of them, no kids to celebrate with, no family close by. Just two people who had been married 25 years and who understood that sometimes quiet was better than loud. You ever regret it? Maggie asked. Regret what? This, she gestured vaguely. The shop, the life. Thomas cut another slice of cake. No, really? Really? He looked at her. You? Maggie thought about it. No, good, Thomas said. Because we're stuck with it now. They both laughed. The work continued. Rebuilds came in. Rebuilds went out. Maggie's waiting list grew to 6 weeks by the summer of 1992, then 8 weeks by fall. She was working 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Thomas handled the books, answered the phone, scheduled appointments, kept track of cores coming in and units going out. They had a system. It worked, but it was fragile. If Maggie got sick, the whole thing stopped. If Thomas got sick, chaos. They both knew it. Neither of them talked about it much. In the fall of 1992, something happened that changed Maggie's perspective. A farmer from outside Ackley drove into the shop one morning with a core in a 5-gallon bucket. His name was Merle Haugen, 60-something. Weathered face, hands like tree bark. He pulled the core out of the bucket, set it on Maggie's workbench. It was heavily corroded, cracked end frame, burned stator. Maggie looked at it. What's this off of? 1963 Minneapolis Moline G1000. She looked up. You're restoring one? Merle nodded. My father bought it new. I'm trying to bring it back. Maggie examined the core more closely. This is a Motorola unit. I know. Maggie pulled open the filing cabinet, found the drawer for Motorola, flipped through cards. She stopped, pulled one out. The handwriting on it wasn't hers. It was her father's. Frank Morrison, 1973 rebuild notes. Maggie stared at the card for a long moment. Merle cleared his throat. You okay? She nodded. Yeah, I'm okay. Can you rebuild it? Maggie looked at the core again, then at the card. Her father had worked on a G1000 50 years ago, had written down the specs, the wire gauge, the turn count, the common failure points, and now 2 decades after his death, that information was still here, still useful, still teaching. Yeah, Maggie said quietly. I can rebuild it. She worked on Merle's alternator over the next 2 weeks. The end frame was too damaged to save, but she had a used one in her parts inventory that fit after some machining. She rewound the stator to the original specification. Using her father's notes, she tested it. 45 minutes at full load, the numbers were perfect. She called Merle, told him it was ready. He drove out the next day, paid cash. $85 as he was leaving, he turned back. I called 3 parts stores and 2 other rebuilders before I found you. Nobody else would touch this. Maggie nodded. Most people won't. Why do you? Because somebody should, Maggie said. After Merle left, Maggie stood in the shop holding her father's index card. The handwriting was faded, but still legible. Frank Morrison had paid attention, had written it down, had made sure the information survived him. And now, 50 years later, that attention had value. It had helped Merle Haugen restore his father's tractor. It had connected 3 generations, farmer to farmer, father to daughter, machine to machine, all through one index card. Maggie slid it back into the filing cabinet, and she understood. This was what lasted, not the machines, not the buildings, the knowledge, written down, preserved, passed along. That evening, she talked to Thomas. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down. I want to make copies of the cards, she said. Thomas looked at her. All of them? All of them. That's 600 cards. I know. How? I don't know yet, but I need to do it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about your father. She nodded. He wrote down what he knew. And today, 20 years after he died, I used his notes to rebuild an alternator. Thomas smiled. That's a good legacy. It is, Maggie said. And I want to leave the same thing. But copying 600 index cards wasn't simple. Maggie didn't own a photocopier. Couldn't afford one. She thought about taking the cards to the library in Eldora, making copies there, but that would take weeks, and she'd have to close the shop to do it. She thought about hiring someone to transcribe them. But who, and how much would that cost? The problem sat in the back of her mind for months. In the spring of 1993, Maggie's waiting list hit 11 weeks. People were calling from Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wisconsin. Some of them shipping cores. Some of them driving out in person. Word was spreading, not through advertising, through results. A farmer would install one of Maggie's rebuilds. It would run for 3 years, 4 years, 5. He'd tell another farmer, that farmer would tell another. And eventually they'd all end up at the White Barn on County Road D35. Thomas suggested hiring help, someone to handle the volume, someone younger, someone Maggie could train. She thought about it. But the idea made her uncomfortable, not because she didn't want help, but because training someone meant teaching them everything. And teaching them everything meant trusting them with the knowledge. And Maggie wasn't sure she was ready to trust anyone with that. Not yet. The years between 1993 and 1997 blurred together: work, sleep, work, sleep. The waiting list stayed between 8 and 12 weeks. The revenue stayed steady, around 70 to 80,000 a year. Maggie turned 50, then 51, then 52. Thomas's hair went completely gray. They both moved slower than they used to, but they kept going. In the fall of 1997, something happened that forced Maggie's hand. Thomas had a minor heart attack, not serious, but not nothing either. He spent 3 days in the hospital in Iowa Falls. Maggie sat with him, watched the monitors, held his hand. The doctor said he'd be fine, with rest, with less stress. But when they got home, Thomas looked at Maggie across the kitchen table. "You need help," he said. "I know, not just help with the books. Help with the work, I know. So are you going to do something about it?" Maggie nodded slowly. "Yes, because if something happens to you..." "I know, Thomas." He reached across the table, took her hand. "I can't run the shop without you. And you can't run it alone anymore." She squeezed his hand. "I'll figure it out." By early 1998, Maggie was 55 years old. The shop was busier than it had ever been. The waiting list was at 11 weeks and climbing. And Maggie knew that if she didn't do something soon, the whole thing would collapse under its own weight. She needed to preserve the knowledge. She needed to train someone. She needed to make sure that when she was gone, the work would continue. But first, she needed to solve a different problem. The index cards, 614 of them now, all in her handwriting, all in one place, all vulnerable. If the barn burned, if someone broke in, if anything happened, the knowledge would be gone. That spring, Maggie did something she'd never done before. She walked into the Eldora Public Library, and she asked for help. The librarian's name was Karen Stiles, mid-40s. Glasses, patient smile. She listened to Maggie explain the situation. The index cards, the need for copies, the lack of equipment. Karen thought for a moment. "We have a computer lab," she said. "Basic word processing classes. Tuesday evenings." Maggie frowned. "I don't know how to use a computer." "That's what the classes are for." "I'm 55 years old," Karen smiled. "I've taught people older than you." Maggie hesitated. "I don't type very fast." "You'll learn," Karen said. "It just takes practice." Maggie started the classes in April of 1998, Tuesday evenings, 7 to 9. 6 other students, all younger than her. Most of them by 20 years. The first night, Karen showed them how to turn on the computer, how to use a mouse, how to open a word processor. Maggie felt ridiculous, but she kept going. It took her 4 months to learn basic word processing, how to type without looking at the keys, how to save a document, how to format text. By September, she was ready. She brought the first stack of index cards to the library, set up at a computer in the corner, and she started typing. 2 or 3 cards a night. That was all she could manage. Between the shop during the day and the transcription at night, she was exhausted. But she kept going. Thomas asked her once if it was worth it. They were sitting at the kitchen table, late. Maggie rubbing her eyes. "Is what worth it? All this typing? You're wearing yourself out." Maggie looked at him. "Do you remember Merle Haugen, the guy with the Minneapolis Molin?" Maggie nodded. "I rebuilt his alternator using my father's notes. From 1973, Thomas waited. If my father hadn't written those notes down, I couldn't have helped Merle. The information would have been lost." "I know," Thomas said, "so I'm doing the same thing. For whoever comes after me." She looked at him. "This is worth it." It took Maggie until the spring of 2001 to finish. 3 years, 614 index cards transcribed into 214 pages. She printed 3 copies on the library printer, brought them home in a cardboard box, set them on the kitchen table. Thomas picked one up, flipped through it. "This is everything?" "Everything I know about alternators," Maggie said. He set it down. "You did it." She nodded. "I did it." She gave 1 copy to Thomas, put 1 in a fireproof box in the house, kept 1 in the shop. She did not publish it, did not sell it, did not put it on the internet, which was a thing she had heard about but did not use. She simply made sure the information would survive her. And that was enough, for now. Because Maggie knew there was more work to do. The document preserved the knowledge in one form. But knowledge wasn't just words on paper. It was also muscle memory, judgment calls. The way you felt resistance in a bearing. The way you heard a problem in a winding before it showed up on a meter. That kind of knowledge couldn't be transcribed. It had to be taught, person to person, hand to hand. And Maggie didn't have anyone to teach it to, not yet. She stood in the shop one evening in the summer of 2001, 58 years old now, still strong, still sharp but not invincible. The filing cabinet was in the corner. The document was in the fireproof box. The knowledge was preserved, but it wasn't enough, because knowledge that wasn't used was just data. And Maggie hadn't built this to create data. She'd built it to help people. Farmers running old equipment, restorers bringing machines back to life, operators who needed quality over speed. They needed someone who could do the work. And eventually, that someone wouldn't be Maggie anymore. She looked at the test bench, the lathe, the winding machine. All of it still running. All of it waiting for the next unit, the next core, the next problem to solve. And Maggie understood the work wasn't done. It was just beginning. The waiting list hit 14 weeks in January of 2002. Maggie was 59 years old. Her hands ached in the mornings. Not enough to stop working, just enough to notice. Thomas was 64. His heart was fine. But he moved slower now. Took longer to climb stairs. Needed reading glasses for the ledgers. They were getting old, not ancient, not helpless. Just old enough that the math started to matter. How many more years could Maggie wind copper by hand? How many more units could she rebuild before her fingers gave out? How many more days before something broke that couldn't be fixed with rest and aspirin? The shop didn't care about age. The calls kept coming. The phone kept ringing, and Maggie kept working. But she knew it couldn't last forever. In March of 2002, she called a woman named Linda Hartford. They'd never met in person, but Linda had been buying units from Maggie for 3 years. Small orders, 5 or 6 at a time. For a parts supplier company she ran out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Linda's voice on the phone was businesslike. Efficient. I have a proposal for you. Maggie sat down at the workbench. I'm listening. I want to buy 200 units a year, maybe 300. Wholesale. Private label for my catalog. That's a lot of volume, I know. Linda paused. Can you handle it? Maggie looked around the shop, at the equipment, at the filing cabinet, at her own hands. Not alone, she said finally. Then hire help. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I'd have to teach them everything, and teaching takes time. And I don't have time if I'm already working 6 days a week, trying to keep up with the waiting list. Linda was quiet for a moment. So what do you need? I need to think about it, Maggie said. She talked to Thomas that evening. They were sitting in the living room. Thomas reading the newspaper. Maggie staring at the wall. Linda Hartford wants 200 units a year. Thomas lowered the paper. That's substantial. I can't do it alone. Then hire some. Maggie shook her head. You don't understand. I'd have to train them. Really train them. 6 months minimum, maybe longer. So who's going to do the work while I'm training? Thomas folded the paper, set it aside. You can't keep doing this alone, Maggie. You're almost 60. I'm almost 65. We need help. I know. Then what's the real problem? Maggie was quiet for a long moment. What if I teach someone everything and they leave? What if they take what I know and open their own shop and compete with me? Thomas looked at her. Is that what this is about? Partially. What's the other part? Maggie stood up, walked to the window. What if I teach them wrong? What if I miss something? What if the knowledge doesn't transfer properly? Thomas stood, came over to her. You wrote down everything you know. 214 pages. You didn't do that for yourself. You did it so someone else could learn. I know, so let them learn. Maggie placed an ad in the Iowa Falls newspaper in April of 2002. Apprentice wanted. Alternator rebuilding. Fatians quiet. Low pay. High learning. She got 11 responses, 8 men. 3 women. She interviewed all of them. Most of them lasted 10 minutes before Maggie knew it wouldn't work. Too impatient, too confident, too certain they already knew enough. One lasted 30 minutes. A man in his 40s who'd been laid off from a factory in Waterloo. He seemed promising until Maggie asked him to explain how a voltage regulator worked. He couldn't. So they make the voltage go up and down or something? Maggie thanked him for his time. The last interview was a woman named Claire Mason, 24 years old, farm background, grew up outside Iowa Falls. Father was a mechanic, had taught her to work on engines before she was 12. Maggie asked her the voltage regulator question. Claire thought for a moment. It monitors the alternator's output and controls the field current to maintain consistent voltage regardless of load or engine speed. Close enough, Maggie said. Claire looked around the shop. This is all yours? Has been since 1978. You do this alone? Mostly. My husband keeps the books. Claire walked over to the test bench. What's this? Maggie followed her. Ford flathead engine. Variable speed drive. I built it in 1978. You built this? I did. Claire ran her hand along the frame. That's impressive. It works, Maggie said. That's all that matters. They talked for an hour. Maggie showed Claire the filing cabinet. Pulled out a few cards. Claire listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't ask stupid questions. After a while, Maggie pulled out the document. The 214 pages. Set it on the workbench. This is everything I know about alternator rebuilding. Every spec. Every failure mode. Every fix. Claire picked it up. Flipped through it. This must have taken years. 3 years to type. 30 years to learn. Claire set it down carefully. And you'd teach me all of this? If you're willing to learn, Maggie said. I'm willing. It won't be easy. I don't cut corners. I don't rush. I test every unit for 45 minutes at full load before it leaves this shop. 45 minutes? Every single one. Why so long? Because some problems take time to show up, Maggie said. And I'd rather find them here than have them fail in someone's field during harvest. Claire nodded slowly. That makes sense. Maggie hired her the next day. $8 an hour. 6 days a week. No benefits. Claire started the following Monday. The first week was theory. Maggie showed Claire how to read a wiring diagram. how to identify different alternator types, how to use the filing cabinet. Open it up and look, Maggie said over and over, every time. No exceptions. Claire absorbed it like a sponge. The second week was hands-on. Maggie gave Claire a burned-out Delco 10SI, common unit. Simple rebuild. Take it apart, Maggie said. Tell me what you find. Claire worked carefully, methodically, removing bolts, labeling parts. After an hour she looked up, status burned. Looks like the rectifier bridge failed first. Shorted. Overheated the windings, Maggie nodded. What else? Claire frowned, looked closer. The rotor bearings are rough, probably were failing, which would cause vibration, which could stress the rectifier. Good, Maggie said. By the end of 6 months, Claire could rebuild most common applications without supervision. She'd learned to use the winding machine, the lathe, the test bench. She'd learned Maggie's protocol. 45 minutes at full load, every time. Watch the numbers. If anything moves that shouldn't, open it back up and figure out why. She'd learned patience, which was the hardest lesson, because Claire was young. And young people wanted to move fast. But Maggie had spent 30 years learning that fast was the enemy of right. One afternoon in October of 2003, Claire finished a rebuild ahead of schedule. She brought it to Maggie. This is ready. Maggie looked at the clock. You tested it? 30 minutes at full load. All the numbers look good. Maggie set down the unit she'd been working on. I test for 45 minutes, I know. But this one's clean. Simple rebuild. The extra 15 minutes won't show anything. Maggie walked over to the test bench, put the unit on, started the timer. We'll see 38 minutes in, the voltage started to drift, not much, just 1/10 of a volt. But it was moving. Maggie shut down the bench, handed the unit to Claire. Open it up and look. Claire's face went red. But I checked everything. Open it up and look, Maggie repeated. Claire found the problem 20 minutes later. A loose terminal connection. Not obviously loose, just barely. Enough to pass a visual inspection. Not enough to hold under extended load. She brought it back to Maggie. I'm sorry, don't be sorry. Be thorough, I thought I was. You were thorough enough for 30 minutes, Maggie said quietly. Not 45, Claire nodded. Didn't argue. That's why we test for 45, Maggie continued. Because some problems hide for 30, and if this had failed in someone's truck, they'd have blamed my work. Not yours. Mine, I understand, do you? Claire looked at her. Yes. You're not just teaching me how to rebuild alternators. You're teaching me how to protect your reputation, close, Maggie said. I'm teaching you how to do it right. The reputation is a consequence, not the goal. By early 2004, Claire was handling a significant portion of the volume. Maggie focused on the difficult rebuilds, the unusual applications, the cores nobody else would touch. Claire handled the common units, the bread and butter, the Delco 10SIs and Motorola alternators that made up 60% of the business. The waiting list dropped to 9 weeks. Thomas updated the books. Revenue for 2004 was on pace to hit 110,000, which meant Maggie could finally call Linda Hartford back. Linda's offer was still on the table, 200 units a year, maybe 300 eventually. Wholesale pricing. Private label, Maggie could handle it now. With Claire's help, but she negotiated terms. I won't compromise on quality for volume. Linda's voice was patient. I'm not asking you to good, because every unit still gets 45 minutes on the test bench. No exceptions, that's fine. And if you have warranty claims, I need to see the failed units. I want to know what went wrong. Agreed, then we have a deal, Maggie said. The first wholesale order arrived in March of 2004, 50 cores. Mix of applications, Maggie and Claire worked through them over 3 weeks. Every unit tested, every unit documented, every unit shipped with a warranty card and rebuild notes. Linda called when she received them. These are perfect. They should be, Maggie said. I've got customers asking for more. Then send more cores. By the summer of 2004, the wholesale business was accounting for 1/3 of the shop's revenue. Claire was working full-time. No days off except Sundays. Maggie was working the same schedule. Thomas suggested they were both working too hard. They ignored him, but something else was happening that summer. Something Maggie noticed in the cores that came back for warranty service. The cheap mass-produced units. The ones from the big consolidators. The ones that had pushed Maggie to the margins back in 1987. They were failing. Fast, not all of them. But enough that the pattern was obvious. A farmer would install a $45 unit from the parts store. It would run for 12 months, maybe 18 if he was lucky. Then it would burn out and the farmer would bring the core to Maggie, ask her to rebuild it properly, which she did. And those rebuilds lasted 3 years, 4 years, sometimes 5. In the fall of 2004, a fleet manager from Des Moines called the shop. His name was Marcus Reed. He ran a company that operated 140 grain trucks across central Iowa. I need to talk to you about alternators. His voice was tired, frustrated. Maggie switched the phone to her other ear. I'm listening. I switched my fleet to cheap units in 1999. Thought I'd save money, and I'm replacing 60 units a year across the fleet. The failure rate is killing me. What are you spending? Parts alone? $3,500 to $4,200 a year, not counting labor, not counting downtime. Maggie was quiet for a moment. What do you want from me? I want to know if you can do better. They talked for 30 minutes. Marcus explained his situation. The cheap units were failing at a rate that didn't make financial sense anymore, even at $45 a unit. Maggie explained her process, her testing protocol, her warranty. At the end of the conversation, Marcus asked the question that mattered. What's your price? $58 per unit for your most common applications, Maggie said. That's more than the cheap units. I know, so why should I pay more? Because my units last longer. And because I stand behind my work. How long is your warranty? 1 year. Unconditional. If it fails, I rebuild it free. No questions. Marcus was quiet. I want to test 30 units. Send me the cores. The cores arrived in November of 2004. Maggie and Claire worked through them in 3 weeks. Every unit rebuilt to original spec. Every unit tested for 45 minutes. Every unit shipped with documentation and warranty cards. Marcus installed them across his fleet over the winter. And Maggie waited. The call came in March of 2006. 14 months after the first units shipped. Maggie answered the phone. Marcus Reed's voice was different this time. Less tired. Less frustrated. I need to tell you something. What's that? Out of the 30 units you rebuilt, I've had one failure. Just one? Just one. And it was my fault. Guy backed into a pole. Destroyed the alternator. Maggie smiled. That doesn't count as a warranty claim, I know. Marcus paused. You know what my failure rate was with the cheap units? What? 18 out of 30. Per year. Maggie didn't say anything. Marcus continued. I've been in the trucking business 22 years. I've dealt with hundreds of suppliers. Parts, tires, fluids, everything. And you're the first one who called me 3 months after delivery to ask how the units were holding up. Maggie had called him in March of 2005. Just to check in. Making sure everything was working. I wanted to know if they were working, she said simply. Marcus laughed. They're working. And I want to send you the rest of my cores. By the summer of 2007, Maggie was rebuilding alternators for Marcus Reed's entire fleet. 140 trucks. The failure rate across the fleet dropped from 60 units per year to 4. Marcus told other fleet managers. And those fleet managers called Maggie. And the business grew. Thomas updated the books in January of 2008. Revenue for 2007 was $156,000. Best year the shop had ever had. Maggie was 64 years old. Claire was 29, and they were both exhausted. But the work didn't stop. Because something was happening in the broader market that made Maggie's work more valuable than ever. The cheap mass-produced units were failing everywhere, not just in Iowa. Across the Midwest, across the country, fleet operators, farmers, small businesses, anyone who'd switched to the cheap units in the 1990s was now dealing with failure rates that bordered on catastrophic, 30% within the first year. By some estimates, which meant if you installed 10 units, 3 would fail before the warranty expired. And the parts stores were processing returns at volumes that cut into their margins. And the big consolidators were scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong. But Maggie already knew what had gone wrong. They'd optimized for price, not quality. They'd automated the assembly, cut the copper, loosened the tolerances, and for a decade it had worked fine. Because the units lasted long enough to get past the warranty period. But the market was saturated with cheap cores, and the failure rates were catching up, and the customers were noticing. Then the financial crisis hit. September 2008, stock market crashed, credit froze, businesses folded. Thomas watched the news every night, his face getting grayer with each report. We need to be careful, he told Maggie. This is going to hurt everyone. Maggie nodded. I know. But the strange thing was, it didn't hurt them. It helped, because when the economy collapsed, people stopped buying new equipment. They kept the old equipment running longer, which meant they needed quality rebuilds, not cheap replacements. Because if your tractor was 20 years old and you couldn't afford a new one, you needed the alternator to last. Really last. And Maggie's alternators lasted. The waiting list went back up to 11 weeks in the spring of 2009. Claire was working 6 days a week. Maggie was working 7, and they still couldn't keep up. We need another person, Claire said one afternoon. Maggie looked up from the winding machine. I know. My brother's looking for work. What's he do right now? Nothing. The factory in Waterloo laid him off. What's his background? Grew up on the same farm I did. Knows Engical, works hard. Can he learn? Claire smiled. He learned from the same father I did. Aaron Mason started in June of 2009, 26 years old. Quiet, methodical. Maggie spent 3 months training him the same way she'd trained Claire. Open it up and look. Every time. No exceptions. Aaron absorbed it faster than Claire had. Maybe because Claire was already there to help teach. Maybe because he'd grown up around machines. Either way, by September, Aaron could handle basic rebuilds without supervision. And the waiting list dropped to 8 weeks. Thomas did the final accounting for 2009 in January of 2010. He showed Maggie the numbers over coffee one morning. 156,000. Same as 2007, Maggie said, in the middle of the worst recession since the Depression. Thomas replied. Maggie sipped her coffee. People need their equipment to work. They do. And you're the one making sure it does. But Maggie was 66 years old now. Her hands hurt more than they used to. Her back ached. She moved slower. Claire and Aaron were handling most of the volume. Maggie focused on quality control, difficult applications, customer relationships, and teaching, because that was what she'd become. Not just a rebuilder, a teacher, passing along 30 years of knowledge. One unit at a time, one lesson at a time, to Claire, to Aaron, to anyone willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to do it right. One evening in February of 2010, Maggie stood in the shop alone. Everyone had gone home. The building was quiet. She walked over to the filing cabinet, pulled open the top drawer, 914 cards now, organized by manufacturer, by model number, by year, each one representing a unit she'd opened and looked at and documented. 3 decades of paying attention. She slid the drawer closed, walked over to the test bench. The Ford flathead engine was still there, still running. 32 years after she'd built it, the South Bend lathe was still there. Still cutting true. Bought in 1978 for $200 at an estate sale. The Acme winding machine was still there. Still winding copper the same way it had in 1961. Nothing had changed in this barn, except everything had changed. Because when Philip Adler had driven out in 1987 to tell her the industry was moving on, he'd been right. The industry had moved on. The consolidators had automated, scaled up, cut costs, flooded the market, and they'd succeeded for about 20 years. But then the cheap units started failing. And the customers started noticing, and the market started looking for alternatives. And Maggie was still there, still in the white barn on County Road D35, still doing it the same way she'd always done it. Not because she was stubborn, but because she was right. Quality outlasted price, patience outlasted speed, knowledge outlasted automation, and a woman with a filing cabinet full of index cards outlasted an entire industry's attempt to make her obsolete. Maggie turned off the shop lights, locked the door, walked back to the house. Thomas was in the kitchen, reading the newspaper. Good day? Long day, Maggie said. She poured herself a glass of water, sat down at the table. There's a Farm Bureau banquet next week, Thomas said. You want to go? Maggie shrugged. I suppose. Might be good for business. Networking. I don't need networking. I have an 11-week waiting list. Thomas smiled. Fair point. But Maggie went to the banquet anyway, because sometimes you went to these things not for business, but because it was what people did in small counties. You showed up. You shook hands. You made conversation. And sometimes during those conversations you learned things, like who was struggling with parts supply chains, or who was frustrated with warranty returns, or who had been watching your operation from a distance for 19 years with skepticism, and who was finally ready to admit they might have been wrong. The woman's name was Sharon Barrett, Dudvest manager at the Case IH dealership in Iowa Falls. Maggie had never worked with her, had never even spoken to her, but she'd heard about her. Everyone had. Sharon Barrett ran a tight operation, corporate supply chain only, approved vendors only. If you weren't on the list, you didn't exist. Maggie had never been on the list. At the banquet, Sharon sat deuce down from Maggie. They didn't speak at first, but the conversation at the table turned, as it often did in February of 2010, to the state of the parts supply chain. Someone mentioned difficulty sourcing electrical components for older equipment. Sharon spoke up. Her voice was measured. Professional. We're having significant trouble with alternator returns. Certain applications. Units failing within the warranty period. Someone asked which applications. Sharon named a few. Common models. Late model tractors. The supply chain's gotten unreliable, she continued. Quality's inconsistent. Corporate warranty department is frustrated. She said this to the table generally. Not to Maggie specifically. Maggie set down her fork. I might be able to help with some of those applications. Sharon looked at her for a moment. Her smile was polite, professional. Small, I appreciate that, but my dealership has to work through approved vendors. I don't think your shop would meet the certification requirements. Maggie nodded. I understand. She picked up her fork again. If you ever want to send a core over just to see what the work looks like, you're welcome to do that. Sharon's smile got smaller. I'll keep it in mind. 6 weeks later, Sharon Barrett pulled into the concrete apron outside Maggie's shop. Unannounced, no phone call, no appointment. Just showed up with a core in the back of her truck. Maggie came out of the shop. Wiping her hands on a rag, Sharon climbed out of the truck, lifted the core out, set it on the ground. I've had 3 failures in 8 months on this exact unit. Maggie looked at it. Same application? Same production batch, I think. Maggie picked it up, examined it. I think I know what the problem is. Sharon's expression didn't change. How? Because I've seen it before, Maggie said. Come back in 3 days. Sharon came back in 3 days. Maggie had the rebuilt unit ready. And something else, an index card. She handed both to Sharon. Sharon looked at the card. It had notes in Maggie's handwriting. Specific first observed, number of times seen, production batch information. You documented this? I document everything, Maggie said. Sharon read the card more carefully. You've seen this exact failure 4 times? In the past 2 years? That's right, all from the same production batch? All from the same batch. The rectifier bridge has a manufacturing defect. Fails under extended load. Shorts the stator. Sharon looked up. How did you know to look for this specific issue? Because I always look for everything, Maggie said quietly. That's the protocol. What protocol? I run every unit at full load for 45 minutes. And I watch the numbers. If anything moves that shouldn't move, I open it back up and look until I find out why. Sharon was quiet for a moment. How long's your waiting list? About 8 weeks, give or take. Sharon handed back the card. I can work with that. And just like that, the woman who'd spent 19 years believing the corporate way was the only way became one of Maggie's steadiest customers. Sharon didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't make a speech. She just started sending work. And the work was good, consistent, reliable. The kind of relationship Maggie had built a business on. Not through marketing, not through sales pitches, through results. By the end of 2010, Maggie had multiple revenue streams running simultaneously. The restoration market, farmers and collectors shipping cores from 30 states, the wholesale business, Linda Hartford's catalog sales, growing every year, the fleet work. Marcus Reed and half a dozen other fleet managers who'd switched after seeing the failure rates. And now the dealership work. Sharon Barrett's operation, sending difficult applications that the corporate supply chain couldn't handle. All of it flowing through one white barn on County Road D35. All of it rebuilt by 3 people, Maggie, Claire, Aaron. All of it tested on a bench built from a Ford flathead engine in 1978. All of it documented in a filing cabinet that now held over 900 cards. Thomas showed Maggie the numbers for 2010 in January of 2011. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. He slid the ledger across to her. 173,000. Maggie looked at the number, blinked. That's your best year ever, Thomas finished. She set down her coffee. How? Because you were right, Thomas said. About everything. Maggie was 67 years old. The industry that had tried to push her out in 1987 was collapsing around her. The big consolidators were struggling. The mass-produced units were failing. The customers were demanding better. And Maggie was still there, still working, still teaching, still opening things up and looking, still proving that patience outlasted speed, that quality outlasted price, that knowledge outlasted automation. She thought about Philip Adler sometimes, the man who'd driven 3 hours to tell her the business was finished. She wondered if he knew what had happened, if he'd heard that the consolidators were struggling while a woman in Iowa was thriving, if he understood that the times he'd spoken about so confidently in 1987 had turned out to be temporary, and that the barn he'd dismissed had outlasted the factories he'd believed in. Probably not. People rarely went back to check on the predictions they'd made with such certainty. They just moved on to the next speech, the next barn, the next dismissal. But Maggie didn't need Philip Adler to acknowledge anything. She had the work, she had the customers, she had Claire and Aaron learning everything she knew. She had 914 index cards, documenting 3 decades of paying attention. She had a 214-page document ensuring that knowledge would survive her. And she had a waiting list 8 weeks long, which meant people needed what she did. And as long as people needed it, she would keep doing it, until her hands gave out, or until someone else learned to do it just as well. Whichever came first, Sharon Barrett didn't become a believer overnight. She sent work, received quality, sent more work, no speeches, no apologies for the 19 years of skepticism. Just cores arriving on Monday, rebuilds shipping back on Friday, the kind of relationship built on results instead of words. By the fall of 2011, Sharon was sending Maggie 15 to 20 units a month, which was significant, because Sharon didn't send easy work. She sent the applications that frustrated her corporate supply chain, the older models, the unusual specs, the units that came back defective 3 times before someone at corporate admitted they didn't know how to fix them properly. Maggie fixed them, every time, and Sharon kept sending them. One afternoon in November, Sharon drove out to the shop, not to drop off a core, just to talk. Claire was at the winding machine. Aaron was at the lathe. Maggie was testing a unit on the bench. Sharon stood in the doorway. Watching. After a few minutes, Maggie shut down the test bench, looked over. Everything okay? Sharon nodded. I wanted to see how you do this. Maggie wiped her hands. We don't have secrets here, I know. That's why I came. Sharon walked through the shop, slowly looked at the equipment. The South Bend lathe, the Acme winding machine, the test bench built from the Ford flathead. This is all original? From 1978? Most of it's older than that, Maggie said. The lathes from 1954, the winding machines from 1961. And it still works? Better than most modern equipment. Sharon stopped at the filing cabinet. What's this? Maggie pulled open a drawer, index cards, every alternator model I've ever worked on. Wire specs, failure modes, rebuild notes. Sharon picked up a card. Read it. Set it down carefully. How many cards? Over 900 now. Sharon was quiet for a moment. You wrote all of these yourself? Everyone. Why? Because someone needed to, Maggie said simply. Sharon turned to watch Claire at the winding machine. How long has she been with you? 7 years, since 2003. You trained her? From scratch. Sharon looked at Aaron. Him too? Same thing. 3 months of theory, 3 months of hands-on, then constant supervision until they can do it without mistakes. That's a long training period. That's the only way to do it right, Maggie said. Sharon left an hour later, but something had shifted. Because 2 weeks after that visit, Sharon mentioned Maggie's shop at a regional service manager meeting. Someone asked about alternator suppliers, complained about warranty returns. Sharon's voice was matter of fact, professional. There's a woman in Eldora, rebuilds to original spec. 45-minute load test on every unit. I haven't had a warranty claim in 18 months. Someone asked for the name. Sharon gave them Maggie's number. And 3 more dealerships started calling. By 2012, the dealership work accounted for 40% of the shop's revenue, which was remarkable. Because Maggie had never advertised to dealerships, had never made a sales call, had never attended a trade show. She'd just done the work, done it well, done it consistently. And the work had found its own way through Sharon, through Marcus Reed, through farmers who told other farmers, through restoration enthusiasts who posted in forums. It moved slowly, but it moved surely, and it always moved toward quality. Thomas turned 70 in 2013. His health was good, but he was tired. He'd been keeping the shop's books since 1978. 35 years of ledgers and invoices and tax forms. He told Maggie one evening that maybe it was time to hire a bookkeeper. She looked at him across the kitchen table. You want to retire? I want to slow down. What would you do? Read, fish, work in the garden. Normal things, Maggie smiled. You've never been interested in normal things. Maybe I'm getting interested now. They hired a part-time bookkeeper in the spring of 2013. A woman from Iowa Falls, 40 years old, efficient, organized. Thomas trained her for 2 months, then stepped back. He still came to the shop a few times a week, checked the numbers, made sure everything was running smoothly. But he stopped working 6 days a week, started sleeping later, reading more, taking walks. Maggie watched him settle into something that looked like contentment, and she wondered if she'd ever get there herself. Because Maggie was 70 in 2013, and she was still in the shop every day, still testing units, still pulling cards from the filing cabinet, still teaching Claire and Aaron the difference between good enough and actually good. She didn't know how to stop, didn't know what she'd do if she stopped. The work was who she was. The years between 2013 and 2018 passed in a rhythm that felt both fast and slow. Fast because the days blurred together. Work and sleep and work and sleep. Slow because nothing fundamental changed. The barn stayed the same. The equipment stayed the same. The process stayed the same. Claire and Aaron both became experts. Could handle any application. Could troubleshoot failures Maggie had never seen before. The filing cabinet grew. Past 1,000 cards in 2014. 1,100 in 2016. The document was updated twice. Once in 2013. Again in 2016. Now 287 pages. Aaron had digitized everything. Put it on USB drives. Backed it up to something he called the cloud. Maggie didn't fully understand the cloud, but she kept the paper copies in the fireproof box anyway, because paper didn't need electricity, didn't need passwords, didn't disappear when technology changed. Paper just was. The revenue stayed steady. Between 170 and 200,000 a year, which was more than Maggie had ever imagined when she'd opened the shop in 1978, more than Philip Adler had thought possible when he'd driven out in 1987, more than enough to live on, to save, to feel secure. But Maggie wasn't doing this for money anymore. If she'd been doing it for money, she would have retired years ago. Sold the equipment, closed the barn. She was doing it for something harder to name, for the farmers who needed their 1968 Internationals to keep running, for the restorers who wanted to bring old machines back to life the right way, for the fleet managers who were tired of replacing cheap units every 18 months, for the knowledge itself, for the idea that if you paid attention long enough and wrote down what you learned and taught it to someone else, something real could survive. Something that couldn't be automated or offshored or made obsolete by market forces. The knowledge of how to do a thing right. In October of 2018, a trade magazine arrived at the shop. Claire had left it on the workbench. Maggie picked it up, flipped through it. On page 14, there was an announcement. American rebuilding solutions to close domestic operations. Maggie read the article twice. The company was the last major domestic alternator rebuilder. had operated a consolidated facility in Ohio since 1995, 150 workers, 3 assembly lines, served parts stores and dealerships across the eastern half of the country. The announcement said the facility would close permanently in January of 2019, all operations ceasing, equipment to be auctioned, workers laid off. The press release used words like strategic realignment, market conditions, operational efficiency, words that meant the same thing Philip Adler's words had meant in 1987, which was that the people making the decision had decided that American labor and American knowledge were costs to be eliminated rather than assets to maintain. Maggie set the magazine down, picked up the alternator she'd been working on, and kept working. Claire came over an hour later. Saw the magazine open on the bench. Did you see that? I saw it. That was the last big rebuilder, Claire said. I know. So now what? Maggie looked up. What do you mean? I mean, we're the only ones left doing this properly. We're not the only ones. There are other small shops, not many. And not at our volume. Maggie set down her tools. What's your point? Claire hesitated. I just wonder if it changes anything for us. Why would it change anything? Because the equipment's still out there. The cores are still coming in. And now there's nobody else to serve them. So we keep serving them, Maggie said quietly. Same as always. But that evening, Maggie sat at the kitchen table thinking about the announcement. Thomas was reading. She was staring at nothing. You're worried, he said without looking up from his book. No, you're something. Maggie was quiet for a moment. The last big plant is closing. I saw that, 150 people losing their jobs. Thomas set down his book. That's not your fault. I know, but it's still sad. It is. Maggie looked at him. We outlasted them than that. You proved them wrong. The phone rang 3 days later, Maggie answered. A man's voice, older, careful. Is this Margaret Brennan? Yes, this is Richard Palmer, Delco Remy. We spoke in 1987. Maggie sat down slowly. I remember. I'm retired now. Have been for 10 years, okay? Richard paused. I heard you're still in business. I am. Another pause. Longer this time. I want to apologize for what? For telling you it was over. For not understanding what you were doing. You were following company policy, Maggie said. Richard's voice was quiet. The company's gone now. Sold. Broken up. The plant in Anderson closed in 2003. I didn't know that. The consolidated plant in Ohio. The one in the article. That was supposed to be the solution. Automation. Scale. Efficiency. And it's closing permanent. 150 people losing their jobs. After the company spent 20 years telling them this was the future. Maggie didn't say anything. Richard continued. We lost the knowledge. That's what we did. We thought we could replace skill with machines. Replace craftsmen with assembly lines. And you couldn't. No, his voice was barely above a whisper. We couldn't. They talked for 20 minutes. Richard told her about the industry's slow collapse, the quality problems, the warranty claims, the customers who'd switched back to independent rebuilders when the consolidated units kept failing. He told her about the workers who'd been laid off over the years, the shops that had closed, the knowledge that had disappeared, and he told her what he should have told her 32 years ago. That people like you were the backbone of this industry, and we should have supported you instead of trying to replace you. Maggie looked out the window. At the barn, at the light over the test bench. I just kept working, she said finally. I know, that's my point. We should have kept people like you. After she hung up, Maggie sat at the table for a long time. Thomas came into the kitchen, poured himself coffee, sat down across from her. Who was that? Richard Palmer, the man from Delco Remy who came here in 1987 to tell me the business was finished. Thomas raised his eyebrows. That took nerve. Maggie smiled slightly. He apologized. For what? For being wrong. Thomas sipped his coffee. Must have been a hard call to make, probably. What did you say? That I just kept working. That's all? That's all there was to say. Thomas reached across the table, took her hand. You know what you did, right? What? You outlasted an entire industry's attempt to make you obsolete. You proved that quality matters, that knowledge matters, that doing a thing right is worth more than doing it fast or cheap. Maggie squeezed his hand. We proved it. Not just me. All right, we proved it. They sat like that for a while, not talking, just holding hands across the kitchen table. Two people who'd been married 43 years, who'd weathered financial crises and industry collapse, and the slow, steady work of building something that lasted. Maggie was 76 in 2019, still sharp, still strong enough, but aging in ways that couldn't be ignored. Her hands hurt more than they used to. She moved slower, needed reading glasses for the small print on the index cards. Claire and Aaron were handling most of the rebuilds now. Maggie focused on the difficult applications, quality control, customer relationships, and planning. Because eventually she would have to retire, really retire. And when that happened, the shop needed to continue without her. She talked to Claire and Aaron one afternoon in the summer of 2020. They were all in the shop, working on different units. The comfortable silence of people who knew each other's rhythms. Maggie set down her tools. I need to ask you something. They both looked up. What happens to this shop when I retire? Claire and Aaron glanced at each other. Aaron spoke first. We were hoping you'd let us buy it from you. Buy it? Not all at once, Claire added quickly. Phase transition. Over a few years, Maggie leaned against the workbench. Keep talking. They had it all planned out. They'd been talking about it for months. Saving money, running numbers. They wanted to buy the shop, keep the equipment, keep the filing cabinet, keep the process exactly as Maggie had built it. No changes to quality, no shortcuts, no compromise. 45-minute test protocol stays? Maggie asked. Stays, Claire said firmly. The index cards stay, right where they are. You never compromise on quality for speed. Aaron looked at her. We learned that lesson from the best teacher we could have had. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. All right, Maggie repeated. We'll figure out the details, but yes, they worked out the transition over the next year. Claire and Aaron would buy the business over 5 years. Monthly payments, manageable amounts. Maggie would stay on as an advisor, available for questions, for difficult applications, for anything they needed, but she would step back. Let them run the operation. Let them make decisions. Trust them with the knowledge she'd spent 40 years building. In the fall of 2021, Sharon Barrett drove out to the shop one last time before the official transition. She found Maggie in the barn. Testing a unit, Maggie shut down the bench when she saw Sharon. You need something? Just wanted to talk. They walked outside, stood in the September sun. Sharon looked at the barn, at the faded sign, at the concrete apron where she'd pulled up 6 weeks after dismissing Maggie at that Farm Bureau banquet. I heard you're retiring, spring of 2022, Maggie said. Claire and Aaron are taking over, Sharon nodded. I wanted to ask you something before that happens. What's that? How did you know? Back in 1987, when the whole industry was moving on. How did you know there would still be customers? Maggie thought about it for a moment. I didn't know, she said finally. I just believed that if you did the work right, the people who needed the work done right would find you eventually. Sharon smiled slightly. That sounds like faith more than strategy. It was both. They stood there for a while, not talking, just looking at the barn. Finally, Sharon spoke again. What's going to happen to this place when you're gone? Maggie looked at her. I'm not going to be gone. Just not here every day, but eventually. Eventually, Claire and Aaron will keep it running, and they'll teach someone else. And that person will teach someone after them. Sharon turned to face her. You really believe that? I have to, Maggie said quietly. Otherwise, what was the point? The official handoff happened in April of 2022. No ceremony, no big announcement. Just paperwork, signatures, handshakes. Maggie was 79 years old. She'd run the shop for 44 years. Rebuilt somewhere between 15 and 20,000 alternators. She'd never kept exact count. Documented over 1,100 different models in the filing cabinet, trained 2 people who could do the work as well as she could, and created something that would survive her. On her last day as owner, Maggie stood in the shop with Claire and Aaron. The waiting list was 9 weeks. The revenue was stable. The equipment was running. Everything was in order. She pulled open the filing cabinet one last time. Ran her fingers across the cards. If you don't know what's wrong, open it up and look. Claire smiled. We know. I know you know, Maggie said. I just wanted to say it anyway. Aaron gestured at the filing cabinet. The cards stay where they are, right where they've always been. Front drawer organized by manufacturer. And the document? 3 copies, 1 in the fireproof box, 1 with you, 1 with Claire. And the test protocol? 45 minutes, full load. Every single unit. No exceptions, Maggie agreed. She walked through the shop slowly, touched the South Bend lathe, still running after 68 years. Touched the Acme winding machine. Still winding copper the same way it had since 1961. Touched the test bench. The Ford flathead still there. Still loading alternators the way it had since 1978. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Maggie turned to Claire and Aaron. This is yours now. We'll take care of it, Aaron said. I know you will. She picked up her jacket, walked to the door, stopped, turned back. Thank you for learning it right, for caring about it, for keeping it going. Claire's eyes were wet. We learned from the best. Maggie nodded once. Then walked out, got in her truck, drove back to the house, and that was that. Except it wasn't that, because Maggie discovered something over the next few weeks. Retirement was harder than she'd expected, not because she missed the work, though she did, but because she didn't know what to do with herself. She'd spent 44 years in that barn, 6 days a week, sometimes 7, and now there was just time, unstructured, purposeless. Thomas found her sitting on the porch one afternoon, staring at nothing. You're not adjusting well. I'm fine. You're bored. I'm not bored. Then what? Maggie was quiet for a moment. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Thomas sat down next to her. You're supposed to rest, relax. Enjoy not working 6 days a week. I don't know how to do that, then figure it out. He smiled. You figured out how to rebuild alternators when the whole industry said it was impossible. You can figure out how to retire. Claire called the next week. "We have a question about a rebuild. Can you come look at it?" Maggie was in the truck before Claire finished the sentence. She started coming to the shop on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Not to work, just to be there. To read cards when Claire or Aaron had questions. To look at test bench numbers when something didn't add up. To occasionally open a unit herself just to see what was inside. Because some habits couldn't be broken, and some knowledge couldn't be taught through documents alone. It had to be lived, practiced, demonstrated. By the fall of 2022, they'd settled into a rhythm. Claire and Aaron ran the operation, made the decisions, handled the customers. Maggie came in twice a week, answered questions, offered guidance. The shop continued, the work continued, the knowledge continued. One Tuesday morning in October of 2024, Maggie was 78 years old, 81. She pulled into the concrete apron, walked into the shop. Claire was at the winding machine. Aaron was on the phone with a customer. Maggie poured herself coffee from the pot they kept in the corner, sat down at the workbench. Claire came over a few minutes later, carrying a core. "We've got an unusual one." "What is it?" 1964 Minneapolis Molin. "Never seen this model before." Maggie stood up, walked over to the filing cabinet, pulled open the drawer, flipped through cards. Her fingers stopped on one card. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was her father's, Frank Morrison. 1973 rebuild notes. Maggie pulled out the card, looked at it for a long moment. "My dad worked on one of these 50 years ago." Claire leaned over to look. "Your father? He taught me everything," Maggie said quietly. "And he wrote it down. So it would last." She handed the card to Claire. "Use his notes. They're good." That afternoon, a young woman walked into the shop. 22, maybe 23. Nervous, Claire looked up from the winding machine. "Can I help you?" The woman took a breath. "Are you Margaret Brennan?" Claire smiled. "No. Maggie's over there." The woman walked over to the workbench where Maggie was sitting. "Are you Margaret Brennan?" Maggie looked up. "I am. My name is Sarah Palmer. Richard Palmer was my grandfather." Maggie set down her coffee slowly. Sarah continued. "He told me to find you before he died. Said you were the one who kept doing it right when everyone else quit. Said he was wrong about you." Maggie stood up. "I'm sorry for your loss, thank you." Sarah glanced around the shop. "He said people like you mattered more than he understood." They talked for 20 minutes. Sarah was studying agricultural mechanics at Iowa State, Maggie's alma mater. She wanted to learn hands-on rebuilding. Not just theory, not just classroom work, but real work. From someone who'd done it for real. Maggie looked at Claire. "You have room for one more?" Claire smiled. "Always room for someone who wants to learn." Maggie turned back to Sarah. "First lesson. Open it up and look, every time. No exceptions." Sarah nodded. "I can do that, good, because that's the only way to really know." Over the next few weeks, Sarah became a regular presence in the shop. She came 3 days a week. Learned the basics, learned the filing system, learned patience. Maggie watched Claire teach her the same way Maggie had taught Claire. And she understood. This was the legacy, not the equipment, not the building, not even the filing cabinet. The legacy was the teaching, the passing along, the ensuring that someone else would know how to do it after you were gone. One evening, Maggie stood in the shop alone. Everyone had gone home. The building was quiet. She walked over to the filing cabinet, pulled open the top drawer. 1,117 cards now. 3 generations of knowledge. Her father's notes, her own documentation, Claire's additions. Soon Sarah's observations, all in one place, all preserved, all alive. She walked over to the test bench. The Ford flathead was still there, still running. 46 years after she'd built it, the South Bend lathe was still there. 70 years old, still cutting true. The Acme wide winding machine was still there. 63 years old, still winding copper. Nothing had changed, except everything had changed. Because somewhere in Ohio, there was an empty lot where a factory used to be. Concrete foundations, chain link fence, for sale sign. The equipment had been auctioned off years ago. The workers had scattered. The building had been demolished, and the knowledge. The accumulated understanding of how to rebuild alternators properly. That knowledge was gone, not written down, not preserved, not taught to anyone who could carry it forward. Just gone. But here, in Iowa, on County Road D35, the white barn was still standing. The equipment was still running. The knowledge was still living. In filing cabinets and documents in the hands of people who'd learned to pay attention. Claire was teaching Sarah how to read the test bench numbers. Aaron was updating a card with new failure mode data. The waiting list was 7 weeks. The calls kept coming. The work kept going. Maggie turned off the shop lights, locked the door, walked back to the house. Thomas was in the kitchen, reading the newspaper. "Good day?" "Long day," Maggie said. She poured herself water, sat down at the table. "Sarah Palmer's learning fast." "Richard Palmer's granddaughter?" "That's the one." Thomas set down the paper. "That's fitting." Maggie nodded. "It is." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Thomas spoke. "You know what you built here, right?" "What's that?" "Something that lasts. Not because it's big, not because it's famous, but because it's real." And because you made sure someone else could do it after you. Maggie looked at him. We built it. Not just me, Thomas smiled. All right, we built it. That night, Maggie lay in bed thinking about Richard Palmer's phone call, about Philip Adler's speech in 1987, about the consolidated plants that had promised efficiency and delivered failure, about the filing cabinet in the corner of the barn, about Sarah Palmer learning to wind copper on a machine from 1961, about Claire and Aaron carrying forward everything she'd taught them, about her father's handwriting on a card from 1973. And she understood factories could close, machines could be sold, buildings could be demolished, but knowledge lived in people, in the ones who paid attention long enough to understand, who wrote it down, who taught the next person. That was what lasted, not the corporations, not the automated assembly lines, not the press releases about strategic realignment. The knowledge passed hand to hand, card to card, teacher to student, generation to generation. Maggie fell asleep thinking about the barn, about the South Bend lathe still running, about the filing cabinet still full, about the test bench still loading alternators the same way it had for 46 years, about Claire and Aaron and Sarah keeping it all going, about farmers finding their way down County Road, D35 because there was nowhere else to go for what they needed. And in her dream she saw the barn 50 years from now, still standing, still working, still teaching, because that was what you built when you did a thing right. Not a business, a legacy, not of money, not of fame, of knowledge, living, breathing, continuing, in the hands of people who understood that some things were worth preserving, worth protecting, worth passing along. The South Bend lathe would keep running. The filing cabinet would keep filling. The knowledge would keep living. As long as someone was willing to open things up and look. As long as someone was willing to write down what they found. As long as someone was willing to teach the next person how to do it right. Maggie Brennan was 81 years old. She'd outlasted an industry, proved the skeptics wrong, built something that mattered. And now she was watching it continue without her, which was exactly what she'd always wanted. Not to be irreplaceable, but to build something that didn't need her to survive, something larger than herself, stronger than one person, more lasting than any single lifetime. The knowledge still there, still working, still teaching, in a white barn on County Road D35, where people who needed quality instead of speed could still find it, where knowledge passed from one generation to the next, where opening things up and looking was still the only way to really know.